brotherhood that they have. Now, Esau is a big topic in chapter 36, and in the New Testament, there's reference of Paul quoting what will be later written in Malachi. And the distinction here is Esau being one that God hated versus him loving Jacob. And this topic is something that has driven a lot of theology in the church. And the interesting thing about it is you could say it's really to make a clear distinction between the way, obviously, of life versus the other, obviously, many ways, but anything that's not of God. And it's worth noting that in these passages earlier, Esau does nothing specifically that could warrant this. Even it was prophesied as they were in the womb. And this is just, again, a clear depiction of this. You could even say the same for Ishmael and Isaac being pictures of law versus grace. And so these ideas, these understandings aren't necessarily against the individuals themselves. Even here in Esau's lineage, you can see that there's many nations that come forth. In some ways, they are a part of this Abrahamic blessing. And that does not mean that they are in God's direct plan, obviously, of the Messiah. And so those are different things, and they're used as pictures to paint very strong symbols of how we understand God, salvation, what it means to love the Lord. Obviously, God calls, and through the cross has made way possible for anyone that would receive him. And clearly we know that not everyone will. And so these pictures paint that. And the overall trajectory, though, will follow the line of the Messiah. As you see in chapter 37, it picks up very strongly with Joseph, of course, following the trajectory of Jacob. Joseph is Jacob's favorite, for it says he's of his old age, but we know how he felt about his mother, Rachel. And the funny thing is, Joseph has this transparency flaw in him, that every dream that he has, prophetic dreams really, when it comes to what will happen with Joseph, he has to tell all the brothers about the favor and about all the good things that are coming to him. And that really causes his brothers to even hate him all the more, not to mention the coat of many colors that his dad would make him. And eventually, as they're out actually near Shechem, the brothers are tending the flocks, and Joseph is sent out that way. And the brothers see him in the distance, and they begin scheming of how to get rid of Joseph for good. And Reuben is hoping, obviously we know Reuben's failings from earlier, and as the firstborn, he's hoping that he can avoid this. So instead of killing Joseph, he mentions throwing him in a pit, again, hoping that he can sneak back and take him to Jacob eventually. This does happen. They rip his coat off and put him in the pit. By the end of the chapter, he's already sold to some Ishmaelites, Midianites that come and are on the way to Egypt. And they take the shredded coat, dip it in goat's blood, and as far as Jacob knows, Joseph is dead. And again, the I guess grief and depression that just hits Jacob just keeps getting worse and worse. They all try to comfort him, but he's beyond comfort. He would much rather just go to the grave in grief and mourning for his son. And so Joseph will carry the narrative here for several chapters in the future, but first we're going to look at Judah in this next chapter. So bless y'all, enjoying this reading together. This is 38 through 40 today. Chapter 38 is really just kind of a single isolated chapter which details Judah's impact in the Messianic line, eventually leading to King David and, of course, Jesus. You have this progression of sons being betrothed to Tamar, and eventually Judah himself is the one that would conceive with Tamar, It's very deceptive, very kind of a difficult chapter. The Bible is brutally honest when it comes to the facts of life. God redeems things for his purpose, but doesn't spare telling it like it is in the sense of reporting the history. And so you have Judah and Tamar, who is his daughter-in-law, that would produce Perez and Zerah. Again, you have twins. This time Perez is the one that would be in the Messianic line, leading to King David and, of course, to Jesus. You have the details of how the firstborn stuck his hand out but then went back in the womb. Again, you have this theme that is going to be popping up multiple times about the younger sibling carrying on that line. Whereas traditionally, you would see the firstborn have the primary power or access. And yet with the Messianic line, it does not follow that at all. Chapter 39, you see Potiphar, which is the house where Joseph was sold into as a servant. Very familiar passage with Potiphar's wife attempting to seduce Joseph. He demonstrates much more character than does Judah or many of the other people that we see in these passages, and flees, and yet him fleeing only gets him thrown into jail because Potiphar believes his wife over the testimony of Joseph. And Joseph, again, his reputation precedes him, and even after he is put into prison, he is considered wise and has the utmost authority amongst all the inmates. The couple inmates have a rural nature to them. The cupbearer and the baker for Pharaoh himself are in prison, and at one point they have dreams that they come to Joseph and interpret. Joseph, by the grace of God, of course, has this ability to interpret these dreams, and one's very positive for the cupbearer, one's very negative for the baker. And the interesting thing is that his interpretation plays out exactly as he says. The cupbearer would be restored, and the baker would not only be punished, he would be executed, and in the most gruesome way for that time. Now you have the kind of cliffhanger of the cupbearer having been told to remember Joseph when he would return to Pharaoh. So we'll pick up with that the following chapter. Thank y'all. Today, looking at Genesis chapter 41, you have 2 years that pass right off the bat from chapter 40 to chapter 41. And after these 2 years go by, Pharaoh now has a dream. And you see that the cupbearer had not remembered Pharaoh, but after seeking help and Pharaoh not being able to find any from anyone else, the cupbearer all of a sudden remembers the help that Joseph was interpreting his dream a couple years ago. So the details of these dreams are spelled out. 7 heavy or fat cows and 7 skinny cows that wind up eating the 7 heavy cows, and yet the 7 skinny cows look just the same. The exact same kind of dream as well with ears of corn. And Joseph is cleaned up, brought from the prison to Pharaoh, and does interpret the dreams. And gives all the credit to God, says he has no ability on his own to do this, but God will interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and does, and says that you have 7 years of plenty that are coming, and then 7 years of absolute drought and famine that will consume all the surplus that was enjoyed through the 7 years. And his response to that, Pharaoh asks him what would be his advice, and Joseph tells him to put someone in charge, to set aside 1/5 of all that's brought in all through those 7 years, and then you have some kind of a system to dole out over the 7 years of hardship. And because of his expertise in interpreting the dream,
Pharaoh gives him power. He brings him absolutely into the Egyptian culture, gives him a wife, and brings him right up to where he has command of everyone under Pharaoh, which is over the entire country. And now you have kind of a hearkening back to the earlier dreams that Joseph had as a young 17-year-old. You have over these next 7 years, Joseph doling out the system, working through it, and then his brothers come through the years of famine. And this is something that we see impacted the entire world at that time. This entire region was overcome by this type of strong famine, and literally you have people coming all over to Egypt. Now, when this happens, the brothers come in and they have to deal with Joseph because he's the one that all this is getting funneled through. And it's been nearly 20 years now since they have seen him, and so they don't recognize him. But of course, Joseph does. And these dreams from childhood comes back to Joseph, but beyond that, surely there must be all other emotions as well that comes back. And Joseph really plays hard line with them, does not reveal who he is or anything of that nature. He deals with them, I would say shrewdly, knowing the whole picture of the chapters to follow, but kind of accuses them of being spies, asks them their story. They tell him about this brother that is no longer with them, and then the one brother that's not able to make the trip. Jacob did hold Benjamin back, saying, I've already lost Joseph, and we know how he felt with Rachel, and now this is his only son from Rachel. So you have all these details, and Jacob, being back home, Joseph makes the deal saying, okay, bring your youngest brother to me. Originally, he throws him in prison 10 days and says that there's going to be one brother that has to go back. He softens on that after the 10 days and says, okay, we'll keep one brother here, and the rest of you go back and bring your younger brother. The issue goes even deeper than when he tells them to return the money. The people that are stocking up the grain that they have purchased to take home, those people loading up the bags put the money in the bags. So by the time they return home, they are just distraught to see that all the money's in the bags. They know that their father, which of course Jacob is truly distraught and very set against Benjamin going back with them. There's very kind of just a tenuous moment. They have the one brother in prison in Egypt, and now they're all at this crossroads.
Today's reading comes with much more resolution, as in chapter 43, you have Jacob wanting to send the boys for more food, and of course, the sons know that they cannot return without Benjamin. So just by sheer means of necessity, Jacob's forced to concede. They do send all the boys on the journey, and when they do get back, Joseph meets them. There's favor and grace met when they seek to return the money. Of course, this time they brought double to be able to pay for the other food as well. They're told that there was no mistake, that they had received their money the first time. They're invited in for a meal. And so Jacob, even though he's still concealing his identity, eats this meal with his brothers. Obviously, he's very emotional to see Benjamin, and he keeps this contained, rushes out of the room, still keeps up the act with them as he begins to send them off. In chapter 44, you see this time not only does he have the money returned to the bags, but he also has his special cup placed in Benjamin's bag. Again, of course, as a test. And this time he sends off someone after them to track them down. Basically says that, he accuses them of stealing the cup, and says that whoever has this cup will wind up being put to death. And when they find out it's Benjamin, they absolutely lose it. They say there's no way that's possible. Specifically, instead of having Benjamin come back to be the prisoner, which is like a softer
version of that same sentence, they insist that they all return. And this time they plead for their brother's life. Judah, who obviously has come a long way since earlier, where he was initially the one that suggested selling Jacob into slavery, and of course all the failing that we saw, I believe, in chapter 38. Now you have him pleading for his life, asking that they would take Judah instead, mainly because of the health of Jacob. And they know his health barely even enabled him to be released to come to Egypt in the first place. And now if they weren't to bring Benjamin back, they know it would be too much. And knowing this, of course, Joseph can't take it anymore. Joseph, as he's hearing this plea, basically bears his emotions and is honest with his brothers, sending out all the Egyptian servants and assistants out of the room. He wails and just confesses his identity and his love for them. And even though what they had meant for evil, God turned around for good, he is not bitter, even though surely they are processing all type of shock and things that Joseph has known for this whole time. They're just kind of first understanding it. Pharaoh and all them actually are extremely excited when they find out that Joseph's family is there. Of course, they love Joseph and are so thankful for all that he has meant for them, and allowing them to survive this famine. And so, through God's intervention in this whole thing, you see kind of these sides brought together, and Pharaoh sends out much offerings and donkeys and wagons to basically to bring this entire family in to live with them going forward in Egypt. And they're sent back to Jacob with the specific instruction, don't argue along the way. And obviously Joseph knows his brothers. And even though they've come a long way, again, this is a lot to process. So this time you have it on a lot better note. Chapter 45 concludes with Jacob saying, surely my son is alive, and I'm going to go make this trip to see him before I die. Genesis 46, as Israel sets out to go to Egypt, he stops in Beersheba and sacrifices to the Lord. The Lord speaks to Jacob and encourages him, reassures him of the covenant, promises him even that Joseph's own hand will be the one to close his eyes upon his death. And that, of course, reaffirms this excitement, this joy to head into Egypt. Next, you have a list of all those that traveled with the family as they moved everyone to Egypt. And the interesting thing here is the numbers listed out. It's reinforced that it comes to 70. 70 is its number of completion. And even as you go through all the different individuals listed, obviously there's some stories that are very difficult, but even amongst all the difficulty and confusion that may exist within a family, God still brings that into completion in the sense of them now going down to Egypt as this unit that will become Israel. So you have this picture of God's plan in motion, and you have them as they get there, Joseph, and this great reunion between him and Jacob. And now Pharaoh is brought into the mix. You get a little sense of the culture, the Egyptians' difficulty standing shepherds, and even a little bit of the progression of how you'll see all of the land owned by the Pharaoh and the Egyptian government. So you see that in chapter 47. And much of that is because of the system of economy in the way that through the famine, eventually the money ran out and they began to barter livestock. And when that ran out, they would sell their own property and even their working livelihood to be slaves and work for the act. This is 48 through 50 today, wrapping up the book. You've had a lot of different instances of the firstborn wind up kind of being surpassed by the younger throughout Genesis, and this will continue today, Genesis 48. You see that Joseph has two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and whenever Jacob is sick and towards the end,
Joseph brings in his sons for his dad to bless them. And he places the oldest son at his father's right hand, which would be the typical designation of power and of the prestige or the advantage. Well, his father prays for them and crosses his hands, putting the opposite effect for the son's blessing. And Joseph calls him out and says, "You have the wrong son." And Jacob acknowledges that and then says that Ephraim will surpass. I mean, Manasseh will be great, but Ephraim will surpass him. And then throughout the entire next chapter of chapter 49, you see Jacob blessing all of his sons. And again, the firstborn throughout Jacob's sons, originally you have Reuben, but by now Judah has been acting as a firstborn, especially throughout the whole process of getting back in touch with Joseph and who will stay, who will go, trying to console their father. And in the blessing, you can see this play itself out in the sense of Reuben is specifically acknowledged with regard to his failing from chapters before, and as well with Dinah and the entire slaughtering of the town of Shechem. Simeon and Levi are called onto the carpet for that as well. And so Judah's next in line, and Judah is given what we consider the firstborn blessing. It's important because, of course, we know the Messianic line falls through there, and then Joseph is also giving a strong blessing as well. But the interesting part later regarding the tribes would be that Levi, through the priestly nature of that tribe, there would be no land involved later when the allotments are set out. And Manasseh and Ephraim, these two sons of Joseph, will actually take Joseph's spot and Levi's spot in the sense of making out the 12 tribes. So you have that kind of framework that would be set up in these two chapters for what would come in the future. And then chapter 50 is the death of Jacob, and of course the promise that he would have been returned to be buried with Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, of course. You now have this big journey, not only of the children, but also with the Egyptian mourners, so much that it caught the attention of the Canaanites because of this great procession of mourning as they would go out to make this return voyage to give Jacob the proper burial. And you have a little bit of a fast forward in at least the acknowledgement of Joseph living 110 years, and then Joseph would also bring up that he would want to be buried with his family as well. You don't see that, but you see the promise that God will return for his people in Egypt. And whenever they do leave Egypt, Joseph's asking that his body would be carried with them to be able to lay to rest. So this concludes Genesis. You have the entire foundation of the biblical story and narrative set forth, the establishment of this family that's been called by God to be set apart and have this original relationship that you see in the garden. God began to rekindle that with his people. So bless you.